Hi, I'm Vera, and my brother-in-law told me to get out of my late husband's company in front of every single person who'd ever watched me build it from nothing. He said it loud. He said it with a smile, and no one in that conference room said a word. I'd been married to my husband for 6 years when he got sick. Not the kind of sick that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that hides in scan results and doctors' voices, dropping half a register when they think you're not listening closely enough. By the time we knew what it was, we had maybe 14 months. We used 11 of them well. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that during those 11 months, while I was driving him to treatment and making sure he ate and sleeping, sitting up in hospital chairs so he didn't have to wake up alone, his family was making a different set of plans. My husband's name was Owen. He built a mid-sized structural engineering firm in Denver called Hayden Group, about 60 employees, commercial and residential contracts across Colorado and Wyoming, profitable, stable, exactly the kind of company his family had watched him grow for 12 years without lifting a single hand to help. He was proud of it. I was proud of him. I'd spent 3 years inside that company myself, managing vendor relationships and project timelines, learning the bones of it until it felt like something I'd helped shape too. When Owen died, his brother stood up at the reading of the will and said, calmly, pleasantly, like he was ordering coffee, "That's fine. We'll be in touch about transitioning Vera out." No one looked at me. His mother stared at the window. The attorney shuffled papers, and I sat there in a gray blazer I'd bought because Owen said I looked like someone who could handle anything when I wore gray, and I thought, they have already decided how this ends. I didn't say anything that day. I thanked the attorney, shook hands, and drove home on I-25 with the heat on even though it was June. Sometimes shock feels cold even when it isn't. What I didn't tell anyone, not yet, was that I had a folder in my desk drawer at home. It was one of those plain manila envelopes, the kind you find in office supply stores, nothing labeled on the front. Inside were documents I had set aside, not because I suspected anything specific, not at first, but because Owen had asked me to keep copies of everything when the diagnosis came in. He'd said it once, almost offhandedly, while we were sitting at the kitchen table going over insurance paperwork. Just keep your own copies, Vera, of everything. I didn't ask why, I just did it. That folder sat in my drawer for 4 months after the funeral. 4 months of his family treating me like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome in someone else's house. His brother, whose name I will not dignify by using often, began calling himself acting director within 2 weeks. He stopped copying me on emails I had always been copied on. He reassigned 2 of my closest project contacts without telling me. He moved the weekly operations meeting to a time I'd specifically mentioned I had a standing medical appointment. None of it was illegal, technically. It was just a series of small doors closing, one after another, quiet enough that you couldn't point to any single one and say, there. That's the moment. That's when they decided I was gone. I went through that folder on a Sunday in October. Owen had been gone 4 months and 3 days. It was raining, that kind of thin Denver rain that isn't dramatic enough to be satisfying, and I had nothing else I was willing to do with myself. I spread the documents on the kitchen table and read through them slowly, the way you read something when you're not sure what you're looking for, but you're certain you'll know it when you find it. What I found was a discrepancy so clean, it almost looked intentional. Owen had updated his operating agreement 18 months before he died, around the same time he first started feeling something was off in his body. The updated version gave me a seat on the managing board and a defined ownership stake in the event of his death. Not a majority, but enough. I had a copy of that version. I had the date. I had the attorney's name on the notary stamp. The version his brother had presented at the will reading was different. The section about board succession had been reworded. My name was still in the document, but the language around my ownership stake had been softened into something vaguer, something that could be interpreted as advisory rather than binding. I sat at that table for a long time without moving. The rain kept going. I thought about Owen saying, just keep your own copies. He knew, not everything maybe, but enough. He'd given me the thing I needed without telling me I would need it, because that was the kind of person he was. He didn't create scenes. He created options. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't cry either, or if I did, it was just a few minutes and then I was done. I opened my laptop and started typing a list of every document in that folder, when it was dated, who signed it, and what version I had versus what had been presented. I worked until 2 in the morning. By the time I stopped, I had a clear timeline, and the timeline told a story that wasn't the one his family wanted told. The next morning, I called a business attorney in Denver named Sylvia Part. I had never met her personally, but Owen had mentioned her once, years ago, something about her being meticulous. I didn't have anyone else to call who wasn't somehow connected to the Hayden family, so I started there. She had an opening on Thursday. I wore gray to that meeting too. Sylvia was exactly what I needed, which is to say, she was not reassuring. She was direct and a little blunt, and she looked at the two documents side by side for about 4 minutes before she said, "These are materially different. The question is whether the discrepancy was an error or an alteration." She told me what I needed to gather. She gave me a list. She also told me to stop attending company meetings until we had a clearer picture, which was advice I immediately rejected, because if I stopped showing up, they would have exactly what they wanted. The next 3 weeks were the most exhausting of my life, which is a significant statement given that I had just watched my husband die. It was a different kind of exhausting. That grief was heavy and formless. This was something else, tight and specific, the feeling of moving carefully through a room where every surface might give way. I kept showing up. To the meetings I was still technically invited to, I showed up early. I asked questions. I took notes on paper because I didn't want anyone tracking what I was accessing on the shared drive. I smiled at his brother when he looked surprised to see me. And I kept my voice pleasant because the best information comes from people who think you've already given up. His mother called me one afternoon while I was in the parking garage after a meeting, and she said, in that gentle voice people use when they've rehearsed what they want to say, that she was worried about me, that losing Owen had clearly taken a toll, that maybe it was time to step back from the company for my own well-being, that staying connected to this place couldn't be healthy. I thanked her for her concern. I said I was managing, and then I sat in my car and wrote down exactly what she'd said, word for word, with the date and time, because I had learned by then to document everything. What I hadn't told anyone yet was what I found 2 weeks into that process, when I finally reached Owen's personal attorney, not the family attorney, but the one he'd started using separately about 2 years before he died. A quiet man named Gerald who practiced out of a small office in Cherry Creek and who, when I introduced myself on the phone, paused for a moment and said, "I've been waiting for you to call." He had a sealed envelope. Owen had left it with him 14 months before his death, right around when the diagnosis became certain, with instructions to give it to me directly, not through the family, not through the estate, directly to me. Inside was a USB drive and a letter in Owen's handwriting. His handwriting was messy, always had been, the kind of handwriting that looks like it was written while thinking faster than the hand could move. The letter said, "Vera, I don't know exactly what they'll do, but I know enough about my family to know they'll do something. I've set aside what's yours in a structure they can't easily reach. The drive has the documentation. Sylvia Park knows the shape of it, even if she doesn't know the specifics yet. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you more cleanly. I love you. Don't let them rewrite this." I read that letter 4 times before I could stand up. Then I stood up, made myself coffee, and opened the drive. What Owen had done, carefully and quietly over the preceding year, was restructure a portion of his personal assets into a separate holding entity in my name alone. It wasn't the company itself. It was something adjacent and, in some ways, more valuable. A portfolio of intellectual property filings, proprietary project specifications, and design systems that Hayden Group had been built around. The kind of foundational material that, if you were trying to grow or sell the company, you would need access to. The kind of material that, without a licensing agreement from the holder, made certain contracts legally complicated at best and void at worst. The holding entity was called Vera Holdings LLC, registered in Colorado with me as sole member. Owen had funded it quietly, legally, and the documentation was immaculate. His family had locked me out of the house. They hadn't known that Owen had already given me the deed to the foundation. I met with Sylvia again the following week. I slid the USB across her desk without saying anything. She plugged it in, read for about 10 minutes, and then looked up with an expression that was mostly professional and only slightly impressed. "They're going to want to negotiate," she said. "I know," I said. "Are you open to that?" I thought about Owen's mother's phone call, the parking garage, the meetings I'd been quietly uninvited from, his brother's smile at the will reading. That specific kind of smile that assumes the outcome before the conversation has started. "Let them come to the table first," I said. "I want to see what they think they're offering." They called a meeting. His brother framed it as a family alignment conversation about the company's direction. 12 people in the Hayden Group conference room, including 2 board members who had known Owen for years and who, I noticed, could not quite meet my eyes when I walked in. I was 7 minutes early. I sat in the chair at the far end of the table. I opened my laptop and connected to the screen on the wall without being asked. His brother opened by saying the family had made some decisions about leadership structure going forward. He used the word cohesion 3 times. He said he hoped we could all agree that what was best for the company was clarity, and that sometimes clarity required hard decisions. He looked at me when he said that last part, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. I let him finish. Then I pulled up the first slide. I want to walk through something with everyone, I said. I'll keep it brief. The screen showed a comparison of the 2 operating agreement versions, side by side, with the differences highlighted. I explained what I was looking at, calmly, specifically the way you explain something when you're not asking for a reaction, just creating a record. Then I moved to the next slide, which showed the Vera Holdings LLC registration documents, the asset schedule, and a summary of what the company's existing project contracts referenced in terms of proprietary systems. The IP portfolio held by Vera Holdings covers 7 active commercial contracts, I said. Any change in licensing terms would require renegotiation of those agreements directly with me. No one spoke. His brother's expression had shifted into something I didn't have a word for. Not anger, not exactly. Something more like the feeling of reaching for a door handle in the dark and finding it isn't where you expected. This isn't personal, I said, which was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie, but I said it anyway because it was the right register to be in. I want the company to continue. Owen built something real here, and the people in this room have built things too, but I'm not going to be written out. I want a formal, documented, legally binding role, and I want the operating agreement issue reviewed by an independent attorney. If we can agree to that, I'm happy to continue the licensing arrangement without disruption. One of the board members, a man named Philip, who had known Owen since they were both 26, cleared his throat and said, I think that's reasonable. His brother didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said quietly, you were supposed to just let this go. I looked at him directly. Owen made sure I didn't have to. The meeting didn't end with applause. It ended with people standing up and gathering their notepads and avoiding each other's eyes. His brother left first, without speaking to me. His mother, who had been seated near the door, paused as she passed me. She didn't apologize. She just said, in a voice that was smaller than any I'd heard from her before, he really did love you. I said, I know. After everyone left, I sat alone in that conference room for about 10 minutes. The Denver skyline was gray through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the same color as my blazer. I thought about Owen in that hospital chair and how he'd spent some of his last clear days making sure I had what I needed, not because he thought I was fragile, because he knew what they were capable of. The formal resolution took another 6 weeks. Sylvia was thorough, and so was the independent attorney, and by the end of it, I had a signed, notarized operating agreement that reflected the original version Owen had intended, with my board seat and ownership stake intact. The licensing arrangement for the IP portfolio continued under a formal agreement. His brother stepped back from the acting director role, and a professional interim director was brought in while a proper search was conducted. None of it made the news. None of it became a scene. It was just paperwork and meetings and a timeline of documents that told the truth more clearly than anyone was comfortable with. About a month after everything was signed, I got a call from a woman who runs a small professional development organization in Denver focused on women in construction and engineering fields. She said she'd heard, through someone she wouldn't name, that I'd navigated something significant in an estate situation, and that she thought my perspective might resonate with the women in her network. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at their spring gathering. I said yes, mostly because Owen would have said yes. I spoke for about 20 minutes. I didn't talk about the legal specifics. I talked about documentation and what it means to build something alongside someone and to have that work treated as invisible. I talked about the difference between grief and strategy, how they can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. I talked about the way people mistake quietness for weakness, how sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. At the end, I said, there was a man who stood up at my husband's will, reading, and told a room full of people I was on my way out. He was mistaken. But what I want you to take from this is that his mistake had nothing to do with what he said out loud. His mistake was made years earlier, the day he assumed I wasn't paying attention. A few people in the room laughed, not cruelly, just the laugh that comes from recognition. Afterward, a woman who couldn't have been older than 28 came up to me and shook my hand and said, "I'm dealing with something similar with my father's business." I gave her Sylvia's card. That felt like the most useful thing I could do. I drove home on I-25 in the early evening, the mountains clear and lit on the left side, the city doing its thing on the right. I stopped at the grocery store because I needed coffee and bread. I stood in the cereal aisle for a few minutes thinking about nothing in particular, which was a thing I hadn't been able to do for most of the past year. There is a version of this story that ends with Justice being loud, with his brother standing in a hallway saying sorry, with his mother calling and meaning it, with some external confirmation that what happened to me was wrong and that the people who did it have been appropriately humbled. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and more permanent. The documents exist. The agreements are signed. The company Owen built is still standing, and I am still inside it, which is exactly what he wanted. A few weeks ago, I went to Owen's grave for the first time since the funeral. It's a simple marker in a cemetery in Lakewood, nothing dramatic. I brought coffee because that felt more like him than flowers. I didn't say anything out loud. I just sat there for a while in the cold November air and thought about how he had understood something about me that I hadn't fully understood about myself, which is that I wouldn't go quietly. That I just needed the right information to know where to stand. I still have the folder in my desk. The original documents, his letter, the USB. I don't look at them often, but knowing they're there feels like something. Not a weapon exactly, more like a foundation. The kind you build on, not the kind you wave around. They thought they were editing me out of the story. They didn't realize Owen had already made sure I was the one holding the original draft. If you're watching this because something in it sounds familiar, I want to say something directly to you. The people who try to erase you are counting on one thing, that you won't know what you have. Start there. Know what you have. Keep your own copies. Pay attention to the quiet things people say when they think you're too distracted to hear them, and understand that patience and passivity are not the same thing. I'm not in this story because I was stronger than them. I'm in this story because Owen loved me carefully, and because I learned, eventually, to love myself with the same kind of care. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever been in a room where someone assumed you were already gone, what did you do? Let's talk about it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any grand philosophical way, just in the ordinary practical sense of actions accumulate. The things people do quietly when they assume no one is documenting, when they assume the other person is too grief-stricken or too polite or too alone to push back, those things don't disappear. They sit there, and eventually the record speaks. Owen's brother made a series of choices. Each one felt small enough, probably, to feel safe. Redirect an email chain, soften some language in a document, make one phone call to a grieving widow framed as concern. None of it dramatic, none of it on its own, provable. But stacked together, over months, it formed a pattern so clear that when I laid it out on a conference room screen, not a single person in that room could argue with it. The cause was the manipulation. The effect was the exposure. That's not poetic justice. It's just math. What I keep coming back to, though, is Owen. What he did took a particular kind of intelligence. Not brilliance, not strategy, in the showy sense, just the quiet, careful kind that understands systems and plans 3 steps ahead without announcing it. He didn't leave me money. He left me leverage. And he left it in a form I could actually use, documented, structured, legally clean. That required him to think clearly during the hardest months of his life, to set aside what he was going through and ask, what does she need to be okay? That's not sentiment. That's wisdom applied with real love behind it. I think about what I had to become during those months too. There was a version of me that almost didn't open that folder, almost let the grief be the reason not to fight. I understand that version. Grief is heavy, and the path of least resistance is real, and sometimes you just want to not have to think anymore. But something in me kept going back to that drawer. Kept saying, he said, keep copies. So keep copies. That small act of following through, of honoring the quiet instruction of someone I trusted, ended up being the thing that changed everything. Resilience gets talked about like it's a personality trait, like some people have it and some don't. I don't think that's right. I think it's a practice. It's the decision made over and over in small moments to stay engaged when disengaging would be easier, to write down what was said and when, to show up to the meeting you weren't supposed to attend, to call the attorney you'd never met because someone you loved once mentioned her name. None of those moments felt heroic. They felt tedious and frightening and exhausting, but they added up. What his family didn't account for was that erasing someone requires their cooperation, at least a little. You have to get them to believe the erasure is final. They almost got me there. That phone call from his mother, that gentle voice, almost worked. But not quite. If you take anything from Vera's story, I hope it's this. The people who try to quietly remove you from what's yours are counting on you to stay quiet back. They're counting on grief, on exhaustion, on the social discomfort of seeming difficult. Don't give them that. Not because you owe it to anyone else, but because the truth has a way of holding its shape if you help it. Owen knew who he married. I'm glad, eventually, I did too.